the NFL has made a number of rule changes. So, this time of year is, camp practices are happening and excitement's getting high around the fan bases around the league because they're getting their first glimpses of the year of teams. But around this time of year also comes, some potential rule changes, things of that nature. And there's been a few. One is affecting overtime. One is affecting roster cuts. One is affecting injured reserve with the designation to return. And then there's also one about the celebrations and easing up on that, which will make for an interesting discussion, I think. But let's start with the overtime. The owners approved shortening overtime, and if you want the information on this, there's a great piece on cincyjungle.com, so check that out. Jason Markham did a nice recap of all of the rules. Basically, owners approved shortening overtime in the preseason and regular season from 15 minutes to 10 minutes. It's to shorten games, and then obviously this is kind of especially interesting if you're a Bengals fan, because the Bengals went and had a tie against the Redskins in that game in London last year. So basically, there's kind of still the same format. They're just cutting it down, I think, in terms of time. What do you think the impact is on that for the league and the Bengals? Because Marvin Lewis has been the master of tie games since he's been the head coach of the Bengals.
Yeah, I think it's very interesting. I like one thing was odd is they came out and said, or kind of implied, the whole reason was player safety, that you would have fewer injuries because you have fewer plays, which seems kind of interesting because there's very few overtime games, and of those, there's very few that go the whole 15 minutes. So you're cutting out maybe a drive out of a dozen or more drives in a game. So on average, each player is maybe playing 5 or 10 less snaps, and somehow that's going to, fewer is probably safer, but it just seems if that's their goal, there's probably other ways to do it. I did look at some of the statistics because kind of curious, okay, we're changing the overtime rule. You're shedding the final 5 minutes. What does that do as far as, game, how it affects games as far as win losses and more ties? And since 2002, there have been 83 playoff games, and only 22 of them have gone past that 10 minutes. So that's like 4 games per season. And if you figure there's something like 256 games, that's basically 1.5 or 1.6% of games each year that are affected. So very, very, very few games that are actually affected. And so it just seems like it's, a very minuscule thing. It just seems kind of odd also, since the league likes to make money, and you make money by being on the TV longer, not less.
Yeah.
So you think, you get more advertising if you're on the game or if you're on your show. So I'm not quite sure what the reason was. I mean, I know this said player safety, but if you're, 1.5% of games are being reduced, by a couple minutes, I'm not really sure what that does. I think the one thing it might do is maybe change the impact of how teams play. So maybe force you to play a little more aggressively. But there's other ways you could do that too. You could just say, hey, we're going to start, by moving kickoffs forward or back, or get rid of, extra point attempts on, kicking extra point attempts. There's different things you could do to try to force teams to be more creative. Now, as a fantasy football person, I love this. And the reason for that is, in fantasy football, anything you can do to reduce the variability in the scoring is great. So, if you're playing an opponent and the guy ends up with his quarterback or running back in overtime, he basically gets an extra quarter to rack up more points against you. So this cuts it down a little bit. So it kind of makes more of an even playing field. So from a fantasy perspective, I like it. Overall, I just don't see it making that much of an impact because it's such a rare occurrence to begin with. So yeah, I guess I'm kind of neutral on the whole thing.
Yeah, there's a lot of ways to think about it, and I like that you brought up player safety because obviously not only thinking about playing an extra quarter in a game and a star player potentially getting injured in that extra quarter is a concern. But also you got to think about long-term fatigue, where say an overtime game is played on a Sunday, right? A team plays on Sunday, and they have to turn around and play again on Thursday night, and they played 5 quarters, whereas the team they're playing on Thursday night maybe just had a standard 4-quarter game. There might be an obvious disadvantage there in terms of fatigue, injuries, all of that. So that plays into it. And I also like that you brought up strategy. And I think part of the reason, I see 2 reasons why some of these rule changes occurred. Number one, I think Goodell really listened to, according to what I've heard about the celebration stuff and other rule changes, it sounds like he really listened to owners and players when it came time to propose these rule changes and get them passed, which is a good thing. I mean, you need to kind of have your employees, if you will, have their voices be heard. So, I think that played into it. But I also think that, it's not really good for the league to see a tie, even though advertising perspective and all of that aside, it kind of muddies the waters. You look at it, and this also kind of plays into the strategy aspect, like you mentioned, that now this is going with the extended field goals that are further back. More teams might be going for 2 because of that. And then, so there's a lot of it's almost becoming a more strategic league based on some of these things. Like you said, more aggressive play calling potentially in overtime. Maybe overtime gets avoided because of missed extra points, all of that. And in the case of the Bengals, they went to overtime with the Redskins last year, I believe, because Mike Nugent had some kicking issues in that game. So pretty interesting stuff. I think it just kind of enhances the strategy of teams. For those that don't believe Marvin Lewis is the greatest in-game manager, this might be a little bit of a hindrance, but maybe we'll see. Maybe we won't see Lewis get so many ties now with the Bengals now that this rule change is proposed and passed. So again, it's 10 minutes instead of 15 minutes in the overtime period. Still the same rules apply where, it's not sudden death like it was before. If you kick a field goal, the other team has a chance to score and tie or win, that sort of thing. Moving on, Scott, roster cuts. This is an interesting rule change. Basically, it seems as if teams, the thing is teams had to get to 75 players before the final preseason game. Now there's basically, and there was kind of sporadic cuts, and part of, if you're a Hard Knocks fan, part of what made that interesting is you kind of saw a player, you got connected to players, and then maybe they made the first cut, but they didn't make the second, and then they didn't make the final cut, that sort of thing. But basically there's one cut down now. And it basically is that 90-man roster to 53. Now this to me is really interesting, and I have a specific reason why. What do you make of this, that basically there's one massive cut down day for teams now instead of the multiple cuts throughout the preseason?
It is kind of interesting. I think for as far as perspective goes of, let's say, your fringe players, maybe your undrafted free agents, or some of these guys who might have been in your practice squad for a year or two that you want to get an extra look. I guess it gives you an extended chance to look at them, because generally when you're cutting from 90 to 75, I mean, most teams pretty much know who they're getting rid of. That's usually the easier cut. The harder cut is when you go from the 75 to the 53 and you're deciding, who is that last offensive lineman, who is, are we taking one extra defensive back because he's good on special teams? Are we, maybe going with that, fourth tight end versus, I think the more interesting cuts are probably that second round. And I think one thing too that, I guess we'll see how it plays out this first year, but there's no rule saying that you must, make those remaining, 37 cuts on that day. So in theory, if the Bengals know that, hey, there's 10, 20 guys that halfway through camp that we know just aren't going to be on our roster, there's nothing saying you can't cut them early. I mean, you don't have to wait until that last day to make every cut. So I'm kind of curious to see if teams do that, if they just wait until the very end and say, okay, we're just shedding half our roster at this point, or if they go through a little longer. And I guess the one thing it does a couple good things. One, those fringe players who might be battling for a practice squad spot somewhere, it gives them a little more chance to get a little more tape to try to make it on another team when they ultimately do get cut, instead of getting cut early and then just kind of floating around hoping someone grabs them. I think the other thing it does, and I'm assuming this is probably why they did this, is it gives your starters, I guess, more of a break in preseason. Yeah. I mean, we've seen it now with the OTAs where the Bengals said, we're not going to have every kicker kick every day because, obviously a kicker kicking 5 times a day is just going to win the guy. We don't want our 5th round pick, Jake Elliott, to get, to overexert himself by kicking the ball every single day. So we're going to rotate him. So I think it's a similar kind of thing where they're, hey, this guy's probably not going to make our roster, but there's no reason to, have AJ Green out there every single play. We know what he's going to do. Let's, kind of preserve him. And same with the other players. So I'm assuming that's the biggest reason, is it gives the guys who probably aren't going to make the team more of a chance to be on the team, more of a chance to get more tape, and more of a chance to keep the starters rested until the games really start counting.
Yeah, and in the preseason, because of cut down day and all that stuff, and when they, as teams get more practices and reps under their belt, that third preseason game is kind of known as the dress rehearsal, if you will, and your starters usually play 2 or 3 quarters. That may not be the case now, especially with still hanging on to so many players. You may not need to. Now, and that could be a deterrent by the time the regular season rolls around, but it also is a major plus because then you're not necessarily trotting out Pro Bowl players and having them get hurt in week 2, week 3 of the preseason in a meaningless game where they could maybe play a quarter instead of 2 or 3, get the needed reps and get out of there. And it does showcase the younger players as well. I find it interesting, aside from everything you mentioned, because I agree with you there. I find it interesting in the respect of kind of more tape on players, but less availability in terms of time frame. So what I mean by that is the Bengals have been one team, but others do it as well, where on final cutdown day or second to final cutdown day, they look at a player and they may add them, even though they seem to have their roster quote unquote set. They still may get rid of a guy or two and add a guy or two that was cut by another team. That's what the Bengals did with Brandon Tate. They've done it with other players before, and they add them to the final roster after final cuts. It's just going to be interesting to see how that gets affected based on players being either being on these fringe guys being on the field longer, maybe them not being available earlier in the preseason, that sort of thing. That kind of interests me in terms of this move. But all in all, I think it's good for teams. It's good for young players trying to find jobs. And this has been a major point of contention for NFL players, veterans, starters in terms of the preseason. They don't like the preseason. They want to see it cut down, and maybe this is a step towards that because they may not have to take as many snaps in those games because guys are being held on to a little longer. But again, there's kind of now one cut down day from 90 to 53. That's going to be interesting. Now, this one is a biggie, I think. It's the injured reserve designation to return, Scott. Basically, this was a new rule adopted, I think, a couple of years ago, where instead of being on the PUP list for 6 weeks and instead of missing the entire season, if a guy was maybe slated to miss 8 weeks, 10 weeks, and you really wanted him back and he proved to be healthy, they could be placed on this IR designation to return. Last year, the Bengals had a couple of players who were eligible for that, in Cedric Pierman and William Jackson. Teams were only allowed to bring back one player from the designated to return IR list, and the Bengals brought back Pierman, which may have rubbed fans the wrong way. They kind of wanted to see William Jackson out on the field, and especially when the season kind of got out of hand at the end there. But now it says basically, I believe it's two players now that are able to be returning from IR designated to return. This to me is interesting. The Bengals have had some injury issues, and unfortunately, they either have misdiagnosed guys or guys have they just said, hey, we're going to shelve them for the year. And you kind of hear later on, well, maybe they were ready to play at the end of the year. So the impact of this rule change, Scott, is what, not only on the Bengals, but around the league?
Yeah, I mean, to me, I've always thought the IR thing was kind of silly. And this is from someone who kind of grew up following baseball a lot closer. And in baseball, they have the disabled list for so many period of days. So it's like 5 days, 15 days, 30, whatever. But there's no such thing, as far as more in baseball, of a 162 DL or disabled list period where you say during spring training, this guy's just out for the season with absolutely no chance of coming back. So if he gets healthy in August, he's a screwed. And it's very odd in football they do it that way, that they say, we're just going to say before the season even starts, the guy's hurt pretty bad. He may or may not come back. But because the rules, the way they're set up, we just have to say he's out for the year, which I think is very unfair because, as you mentioned, this past year, the Bengals had a couple guys who did come back who ultimately were healthy. And there's, probably guys in the previous years who the same thing, probably come November, December, they probably could have played. But because they were on IR, they weren't able to come back. And so, like you said, we saw that with the Bengals, and they had to choose between Cedric Pierman, the journeyman special teamer, or I guess the veteran special teamer, and the first-round pick, William Jackson. And, yeah, I agree. A lot of fans would have wanted to see Jackson because he was a first-round pick, and the season's over, so why not see what you can get with this guy? So any move they make to increase the number of guys that can come back from IR, I think is a great thing because I think it's more fair to the teams and more fair to the players to give them that chance to come back because sometimes it's hard to know in August, how healthy a guy is going to be, 3 months down the road. You don't really know, is the surgery going to take? Was it as bad as we thought it was going to be? Did he have a really good rehab? You just don't really know those questions. And it just seems so unfair to these players and to teams and everyone involved to say, yeah, you're just done. Regardless of what happens, you're just done for the year. So anything they do to improve that, I can only say is a positive.
Yeah, and obviously the argument would be that say a team is kind of in that playoff push towards the end of the year, and they have a Pro Bowl player or two on IR designated to return, and those are players that could come back and potentially push them over the edge to get them into the postseason because of their performances. And I think it just makes teams more competitive, and it's a league that's built on parity, as we've heard so many times. And I think it's overall, I agree. I think it's a good thing. I think that, some players, while some players get rushed back too soon from rehab or an injury, there are many players who obviously are disappointed that their season has ended really sometimes before it began. And maybe it didn't really need to be that way. Maybe they could have, come back at a later date and still played well and remained healthy the rest of the way. So, and I think this, modern medicine is what it is now. Players can bounce back and recover from what used to be very significant injuries, and they can come back a little faster than they used to. So I think that also plays into that. The last rule change, Scott, and this one is interesting. Roger Goodell sent a letter to the league basically saying that players will, quote, have more room to have fun after they make big plays. There's been a lot of penalties and fines and all of that based on taunting, based on excessive celebration in the end zone, all of that stuff. We Cincy Jungle did a post on it, kind of asking the writers some of their favorite celebrations they've seen from Bengal players over the handful of years, and I noted one that it was Chad Johnson putting the football with the pylon. That while it was entertaining and while his stunts kind of got old to me after a while, that cost him $5,000 for that simple thing. So I guess what my question to you is your mindset on this. Are you more of an old school guy that says, hey, act like you've been there before, have some fun, but let's keep it under control? Or do you like seeing these guys because it is such a highly emotional sport that is very physical and momentum can swing at any moment based on a play? Are you more of that guy who says, hey, who cares? Let them have fun. It's sports, but it's also entertainment. So I don't know, your thoughts.
I'd say I'm more of the Barry Sanders fan in that regard. Cross the end zone, toss the ball to the ref, jogging over the sideline. That being said, I recognize not everyone has that same mindset that I do. And, it is a very physical, emotional charge game. I mean, you're obviously pushing, fighting. And, hey, you make the big play. We finally accomplished the goal, get across the goal line. And, at the end of the day, it's a game. And so I'm okay with the celebrations as long as I think my only caveat to that is as long as they're not doing anything explicit. And, as far as like vulgar, where you wouldn't want to be watching it with like your kids or grandparents or whatever, and, have to, be like, okay, that's just over the line. Or I guess I'm also not a big fan of the props because that kind of shows like a premeditated nature. And it's not so much an outburst of excitement, but it's more about me. It's more I'm going to enhance my brand, and I'm pre-planning these, setting getting kind of things like the cell phone or the Sharpie there, so when I cross the goal I can sign the football and take a phone call and that kind of silly. So those are where I kind of draw the line. Is I'm not a huge fan of anything that's a bit explicit or where they have like the props pre staged in the end zone. But anything other than that, where you're just celebrating like, yeah, that was a heck of a play. We just, we finally drove down the field, finally scored on these guys. If you want to, slam dunk the ball over the goalpost or, do the icky shuffle or the electric slide or, whatever, those kind of things I'm cool with. One thing I will say I find very interesting is a lot of the cameras, as soon as someone scores the touchdown, they focus right on the guy that does that celebration. They pretty much zoom right on them, and as they go to sidelines, and every time Chad Johnson scored, all the cameras were on him because they wanted to show what he was going to do. And then what did the same media people do later that day? On the sports talk shows and on the radio the next day, they grumble about the players doing these things.
Yeah. And
it's kind of silly that we're going to show this and we're going to keep showing this to you and we're going to show it as a highlight. And then the next day we're going to grumble about how horrible it is that these people are doing. Well, if you don't think it's that good, they just, if those folks don't want to see them do it, just don't show it. So, but if they're going to show it, then I'm perfectly, fine, because now the league's saying they can do it. And as long as it's not over the line and it's not, some 5-minute, we're all going to line up and do, some big river dance thing together as a big group and do like a whole entire song. Okay, yeah, there's definitely some boundaries, but I guess I'm not too opposed to it. I usually don't get too much into them. So if there's more of them, I can't say I'm going to be watching more of them. That's usually when I get up and get a drink, go to the bathroom anyways, right after they score. So I don't see too many of the dances anyway. So I can't say it. Yeah, I can't say it bothers me much one way or the other. Yeah. But I did love the Icky Shuffle.
Well, yeah. I mean, every Bengals fan loves the Icky Shuffle. I like the fact that they're loosening it up. And, the last thing you want to see is, your team's down by 5 with, a minute and a half to play. And all of a sudden, you score an 80-yard touchdown and your team is psyched. And the player who scored the touchdown, maybe he throws the ball into the stands. And all of a sudden, a subsequent 15-yard penalty happens. And then the team that you just came back on gets excellent field position on the ensuing kickoff. They come down and they tie or win the game from that. I mean, that's to me, if you're a fan of that team, that stinks. I am old school like you. I don't like to see utterly ridiculous things. And when I saw this rule, I kind of thought, I don't know if you've seen this movie, Scott, Basketball. It came out in the late 90s, and it stars the creators of South Park. It's a bit crude, but there is a part in it where it kind of talked about how sports devolved, I guess, into only wanting money, and they showed these elaborate – it was more about celebrations and showmanship and instead of the sport, and there were some really funny celebrations. So those who have seen the movie Basketball know what I'm talking about. But I also, my main concern with it is the gray area for this is huge. So while you look at it and you say, okay, the celebration Antonio Brown did, I think it was last year or the year before, where he was basically air humping after he scored a touchdown, that's not going to be allowed. The one from a few years back where Randy Moss pretended to moon the Green Bay team and put his butt on the field goal post, that's not going to be allowed. But what's the gray area? Or where do you draw the line? If a guy absolutely spikes the ball too hard, is that excessive? If he kicks the ball into the stands, is that excessive? If he gets other players involved, which was previously outlawed, is that now allowed? I worry about the gray area, and I worry about, hey, Goodell said he listened to the players on this one, and is it just going to get out of control and then they rein it back in a year or two from now? Are they still going to maintain control in terms of the referees in the game when it comes to this kind of stuff? Is it going to be after not every play, but I mean, there are big plays quite frequently in a game. Is every first down going to be ridiculously celebrated? Every big tackle? I just kind of worry about that. Do you?
Yeah, I think the one thing you mentioned that kind of resonates is the making the refs basically police it. Because, if you're a referee, I don't really think that should be part of your job. You shouldn't have to, you're not dancing with the stars ref. You shouldn't have to sit there and, get your little score sheet and say, okay, that was a little over, or okay, technically, okay, that's 15 yards, or, oh, okay, you're just on our line. There's more important things the ref should be doing. So I'd say unless it's just something egregious, like where you're like, okay, that's just not called. They probably shouldn't flag them at all and just leave it up to the league to say, either do it replay, have a guy in the booth who's like part of the corporate office in New York or something that calls the refs up on the field and says, hey, flag that, or just wait till the game's over and send that guy a bill in the mail next day saying, hey, you're fined $10,000 because that was over the line. And instead of making the refs try to make that decision, because let's say you have 16 games one week, you have 16 officiating crews, 16 different referees, and yeah, you want to be consistent, but the nature of it, there's going to be certain variability, and each ref is going to have in their own mind what they think, regardless of how much training you try to show that this is okay, this isn't. It's a judgment call, and it's right there at the spot. And, it depends on where he's standing, what he hears, what he sees, where the players are. It may look one way to the TV, may look another way to the fans, and may look another way to the ref standing right there next to him. So, to me, I guess policing that isn't something I think the refs should have to do. So, I guess I would prefer that either the league comes out with some sort of way to make it to make that easier on the refs, because the last thing you want is to be, fighting for a playoff spot and then you get a very arbitrary flag call on a celebration that you could argue that 3 times earlier in the game there was a similar celebration that wasn't flagged, and then all of a sudden, and the fans and players are like, what the heck? That's not something that, at least to me, I don't think the refs should have to be policing that.
I absolutely agree, and you may have referees on the older end of the age spectrum who may be way more conservative in this respect, and are a little bit more flag happy when it comes to the celebrations. And you may have maybe a newer ref, younger end of the age spectrum, who may allow more. It's kind of arbitrary, and I'm interested to see how it plays out. In terms of referees, I am interested to see when Ed Hockley calls a excessive celebration penalty, because he likes to really put out a soliloquy when he explains penalties. So I'm interested to see how he explains some of that stuff. We had an interesting comment in the YouTube chat from Jungle Growler. He says, "I hate this rule change. Remember the Steelers dancing in the end zone after that cheap shot on Giovanni Bernard," which is in reference to that 2015 wild card game. Ryan Shazier hit what, in my opinion, should have been a penalty, a helmet-to-helmet hit on Bernard as he was catching a pass, and he was out for the rest of the game. And 2 Steelers defensive backs, as he was being tended to by trainers, 2 Steelers defensive backs were dancing and celebrating as he was laying on the ground, and that should have been flagged as well. Wasn't. So again, it's an arbitrary rule. I'm not huge on it. I'm glad the players are happy about it, I guess, but I don't know. I think Jeremy Hill's probably going to be pretty creative if he gets into the end zone this year, and he's been in the end zone quite frequently in his career, so he'll probably get pretty creative. But it also delays the game a bit. If after many first downs, guys are celebrating after each catch, that sort of thing, can slow the game down a bit, and that's something to consider as well. What do you think about the rule changes? You can get in touch with us on Twitter at BengalsOBI. We're on Cincy Jungle. All of our content's there. We're also live there every week, as we are on our YouTube channel. Join us there. If you're unable to join us live, you can catch the content on iTunes, at Cincy Jungle, as I mentioned, on YouTube, and the audio links are on SoundCloud. Please download. Let us know what you think. Give us comments, and we'd love to hear back from you. We will be trying and taking some fan questions a little bit later in the show, so leave those either in the comment thread at Cincy Jungle or in the YouTube chat.